In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the rise of absolute monarchs. So you can see here, I already have some things outlined out for you, so you can title these notes Rise of Absolute Monarchs and Nation States. We'll just be adding to these notes throughout the unit. So we're going to talk about the transition between medieval kings to absolute monarchs. So you can title your first section The Rise of Absolute Monarchs, and then we are going to make a subheading under that from weak medieval kings to absolute monarchs. So the background that you want to get down here, basically during the Middle Ages, most rulers were men, and they were pretty weak kings, exercising little power over the feudal lords, and usually only ruling their royal domain, whether that be their plot of land, their small kingdoms, the lands that belonged to the royal family. So again, those would vary in size, but during the medieval times, it was relatively small. Near the end of the Middle Ages, the king, particularly in places like England, France, Spain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, the king began to extend his rule at the expense of the nobles, kind of the highest people in that chart underneath the king. By the 17th century, the king had become an autocrat or an absolute monarch. That's a part that I'm going to go ahead and write down. So by the late 17th century, the king had become what's known as an autocrat. And then I am going to just put a box around that word, autocrat. And then over here, you can see my definition. So, an autocrat is a ruler who has full, unchecked power and whose survival relies on dominance, threat of punishment, or violence. This is also what we call tyranny. And there was a British lord later on in the late 1800s. He has a famous quote kind of referring to absolute monarchs. And he says, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." So, again, an autocrat and an absolute ruler, they are synonymous with one another. So, the next section that I would like you to add, okay, our next section is going to be title letter B, and we're going to look at the factors strengthening royal power. Okay, and as you can see, we're going to talk about quite a few different items here. The first factor that strengthened royal power were the Crusades. Okay, the Crusades strengthened royal power because they killed many feudal lords. So the reason why the Crusades are significant is because as there are fewer and fewer feudal lords, there are fewer people that are going to challenge the king's authority or that they're going to challenge his position. And if you don't remember what the Crusades were, okay, I'll just put a little arrow here out to the side. The Crusades were your series of religious wars. Okay, and a lot of feudal lords and knights went to go fight in those. The second is the rising middle class. supported a monarch because they wanted strong protection of their property and trade. So I'm going to write here the rising middle class supports a strong monarch because of protection that he offers. And again, you want to have down that it's that protection of their property and the trading industry that had gotten revived after the Middle Ages. The third factor is the introduction of gunpowder. So the introduction of gunpowder, it equipped the king's armies with enough power to destroy the castles of feudal lords. So those feudal lords that were left that had significant property, again, he could go in with the invention of gunpowder and they could launch cannons. They could they could be able to destroy those castles. So I'm going to write here that these allowed for destruction of feudal lords' castles. Next factor that strengthens royal power is the Reformation. And the Reformation helped strengthen the power in a lot of ways. But one of the main ways that the Reformation is that it provided the monarch with powers once held by the church. And I'm going to abbreviate Roman Catholic Church there. And then there was also the last factor is that there was a growing sense of nationalism. And that led to the monarch being the sign of national unity. Okay, and if we don't know what nationalism is here, I'm going to box it. And I'm going to just write, I'm just going to draw a little arrow down here. And this is going to be, nationalism is just intense pride in one's nation or ethnicity. Okay, so that is your and that is your last one under okay, and that's the last factor for strengthening and that is the last factor for strengthening royal power. I want to reiterate here with the Reformation, not only did the Reformation provide the monarch with powers once held by the Catholic Church, but it also provided the monarch sometimes with property that was once owned by the Catholic Church. The more land or the more property they control, the more powerful they become. So again, moving on to my last one with this growing sense of nationalism, the monarch became that symbol of unity. So all the French people, and this is just an example, but all the French people could be like, you know, we're so prideful of being French. We have symbols, we have colors, and we are all united under this one king. And that was something that was kind of new to this era. Okay, our last factor in the rise of the absolute monarch is this theory of the divine right of kings. So I am going to erase this. Kind of ran out of room here, so I'm just going to make a little heading out to the side over here, and I'm going to write C, divine right of kings. Okay, and then divine right is an ID term, and we scroll over here, I have given you your definition here. So, divine right, or the idea of divine right, is the theory or the idea that the monarch receives the right to rule directly from God and not from the people. Sounds pretty similar to um, the power that the Pope held within the Roman Catholic Church. But the divine right really ties directly into this definition of an absolute ruler. Okay, they have full unchecked power because they're not receiving that power from the people, they're receiving it from directly from God. Okay, so again, here's your definition of divine right. So the divine right, and over here I put that it's a theory that attempted to justify this use of unlimited power through three main arguments. I'm going to outline those arguments here. Okay, the first argument for divine right is that the king ruled by God's authority. So the king rules by God's authority and as God's earthly representative. So basically, um, he is doing the work of God on earth. That is the job of the king. The second is that obedience to God, or I should flip that, obedience to the king meant that you were obedient to God. You did not obey the king, you were also defying God. And lastly, is that the king could do no wrong, because obviously he is ruling, he is getting those orders straight from God, so there is no way that anything he does is wrong. The last thing I want to point out is that the divine right idea, or the idea behind divine right, is in stark contrast to democracy. And that's where we'll stop today. We'll pick up our next lecture with the rise of nation states.